The girl had not eaten in 2 days. Her lips were cracked, her eyes red from dust and fear, her wrists bound with rough hemp rope that burned her skin every time she moved. The summer sun over Dodge City was merciless that year of 1877, turning everything into a furnace. Even the air seemed to hiss with judgment. Lila Burns sat on the back of a wooden wagon in front of the stockyard, clothes torn and dirty, barefoot, trembling. She was surrounded by men who laughed and spat tobacco juice into the dust. Some pointed, others whispered behind calloused hands. They said she was lucky to be alive. But Lila did not feel lucky. She felt like livestock awaiting auction. When she whispered, her voice was barely a ghost. "Please, do it quick." No one listened. The crowd was busy haggling over her as if she were a lame mule or diseased cattle. Silas Crow, the man who had dragged her from the Santa Fe Trail, waved a piece of paper in the air. Sweat stained his shirt collar, and a week's worth of beard covered his face like patches of dead grass. His voice carried the rasp of whiskey and cigarettes as he addressed the gathering of cowboys, merchants, and drifters. "I'm telling you, boys, she costs more to feed than she's worth." Crow laughed, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Someone ought to take her before the marshal finds out I'm selling people instead of cattle." The crowd chuckled nervously. Human trafficking wasn't uncommon in the territories, but it wasn't often conducted so openly, even in a place as lawless as Dodge. Behind the crowd, in the shadows of the livery stable, Wade Matthews, the town sheriff, watched with disinterest. His badge caught the sunlight as he shifted his considerable weight from one foot to another. His eyes never met Lila's, never acknowledged the crime unfolding before him. He simply watched, a silent guardian of the wrong side of justice. The crowd parted like a dusty curtain as a tall figure moved forward. Eli McKenna stood a head above most men in the gathering. At 58, his frame remained imposing, though time had begun its inevitable work on him. His beard and hair had gone steel gray, and deep lines mapped his face, especially around eyes that had seen too much death. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt, worn buckskins, and boots that had walked 1,000 miles. Nothing distinguished him from any other aging rancher except the intensity of his gaze and the way men instinctively stepped aside as he approached. McKenna had come to Dodge to sell cattle, not to buy human beings. He'd intended to finish his business, perhaps have a quiet drink, and return to his ranch in Cimarron Valley. But the commotion at the stockyard had drawn him, and now he stood facing a ghost from his past. He knew Silas Crow. Years ago, Crow had swindled several homesteaders out of their land near McKenna's ranch. Good people who had trusted the wrong man. Eli had testified against him, but Crow had friends in high places, and the charges had been dismissed. Now here he was again, selling a human being as casually as a horse. "She's used goods," Crow continued his sales pitch, "a mouth that talks too much. But she's educated, can read and write better than half the men here." He yanked Lila's hair back, forcing her to look up. "Show him your eyes, girl." Lila's gaze rose slowly. Her eyes were remarkable, a deep blue that seemed almost violet in the harsh sunlight. But it wasn't their color that caught Eli's attention. It was the defiance still burning there, despite her circumstances. This was not a woman broken, merely one cornered. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps. Or maybe just the silent acknowledgement between two souls who had seen the darker sides of humanity. Eli's hand moved to his belt, to the small leather pouch that hung beside his holster. Inside was his most precious possession, his late wife Margaret's wedding ring. He never wore it, couldn't bear to, but he kept it close, a talisman of sorts. His fingers brushed against it now, as they always did when he needed to make a difficult decision. "How much?" Eli's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. It was a deep voice, weathered by years and grief, but still commanding. Silas smirked. "She's more trouble than she's worth. Give me $1 and she's yours." A laugh rolled through the yard. A human life for $1. Eli reached into his pocket, pulled out a single worn coin, and dropped it on the barrel between them. The clink of metal cut through the noise. Every man froze. "Get her papers," Eli said quietly. Silas reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, a fraudulent bill of sale he'd created, as if Lila were legitimate property. He pushed it toward Eli with a smirk. Eli didn't touch the paper. Now write your name on it. Silas hesitated, confusion crossing his face. Write your name, Eli repeated, his voice harder now. So everyone sees this trade was yours. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the distant sounds of Dodge City, piano music from the saloon, the blacksmith's hammer, the occasional shout, seemed to fade away. Silas hesitated, but Eli's voice carried weight. In the law of the frontier, even $1 made a transaction binding. Reluctantly, Silas scrawled his signature on the paper. What Silas thought was a simple sale was now a record. Evidence that Silas Crow had engaged in human trafficking, a federal crime punishable by hanging. Eli finally took the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it inside his shirt. Then he turned to Lila. Get down from that wagon. Lila hesitated. She had learned to be wary of men who bought women. Often they were worse than the ones who sold them. But something in Eli's eyes, not kindness exactly, but a steady sort of decency, made her slowly rise to her feet. Her legs nearly gave out as she climbed down. She hadn't stood properly in days. Eli didn't touch her, didn't offer his hand. He simply waited until she was steady. Then he pulled out a knife. Lila flinched, taking a step back, but Eli merely cut the ropes binding her wrists. As the hemp fell away, revealing raw, bleeding skin beneath, a collective murmur went through the crowd. They were beginning to understand what was happening. You can't do this, McKenna, Silas growled, his hand moving toward the gun on his hip. I just did, Eli replied calmly. I paid $1 for her freedom, not for her. And now I have your signature admitting to selling a human being. He gestured toward Sheriff Matthews, who had straightened up, suddenly alert. Even your friend with the badge can't ignore federal law when there's written proof. Matthews' face darkened. His eyes narrowed as they flicked from Silas to Eli, calculating the political cost of each possible action. Silas lunged forward, reaching for the paper, but Eli stepped back smoothly, his own hand resting lightly on his holster. Silas froze. Every man in Dodge knew Eli McKenna's reputation with a gun, not as a gunslinger or a brawler, but as a man who shot straight and only when necessary. This isn't over, McKenna, Silas spat. It is for today, Eli replied. He turned to Lila. My wagon's by the general store. Can you walk? Lila nodded, still stunned by the turn of events. She took a tentative step, then another, moving away from Silas and toward this stranger who had just changed the course of her life with a single dollar. The crowd parted again, some men tipping their hats respectfully to Eli, others looking away in shame or discomfort. A few nodded with approval. Even in the wild territories, there were lines most men wouldn't cross, and selling women was one of them. As Lila and Eli moved away from the stockyard, Sheriff Matthews finally stirred from his post. He intercepted them, his considerable bulk blocking their path. This is a dangerous game you're playing, McKenna, he said quietly, ensuring only Eli could hear. Some powerful people have investments in Crow's business. Eli met his gaze steadily. Then they'd better find a legal business to invest in. Matthew's face flushed red. You always were self-righteous, even back when you hunted men for money. Eli didn't respond to the barb. He simply waited until Matthews stepped aside, then continued toward the general store, Lila following a step behind. From the edge of the crowd, a well-dressed man observed the exchange. James Harrington, the town's lawyer, had witnessed the entire scene with great interest. Unlike most in Dodge, Harrington had formal education, a law degree from Harvard, and experience as a federal prosecutor back east. He'd come west seeking adventure and fortune, finding mostly the former. Now he watched as Eli McKenna single-handedly upended the town's corrupt equilibrium. As Lila and Eli disappeared around the corner, Harrington noticed Silas and Matthews huddled in intense conversation. Their faces were dark with fury, and both men glanced repeatedly in the direction Eli had gone. Harrington sighed and adjusted his spectacles. He had a feeling he would be needed before this business concluded. Legal minds were rare in places like Dodge, but violence was common as dust. And what he'd just witnessed would surely stir up plenty of both. Eli McKenna's wagon was simple but well-maintained, pulled by two sturdy draft horses that stood patiently in the afternoon heat. He helped Lila onto the seat without touching her more than necessary, then handed her a canteen. Drink slowly, he advised as he climbed up beside her. Too much at once will make you sick. Lila took the canteen with trembling hands and sipped the lukewarm water. It was the sweetest thing she'd tasted in days. She watched Eli warily as he gathered the reins and clicked to the horses. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked as they pulled away from the bustling main street of Dodge. "Away from here," Eli replied simply. He glanced at her raw wrists. "We'll stop by the river. You can wash those cuts." They rode in silence for a time, the creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves the only sounds. The dusty buildings of Dodge City gradually gave way to the vast expanse of the Kansas prairie. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tall grass that rippled like a golden sea in the warm breeze. Lila studied her rescuer surreptitiously. Eli McKenna was a hard man to read. His face gave away little, and his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, in the careful way he held himself, that spoke of old wounds carried with dignity. "Why did you help me?" she finally asked. Eli was silent for so long that Lila thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was quiet but clear above the wagon's noise. "I knew the man selling you," he said, "and I knew he was the kind who'd trade his own shadow for whiskey." It wasn't really an answer, and they both knew it, but it was all he seemed willing to offer. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they reached the Arkansas River. Eli guided the wagon to a secluded spot where a stand of cottonwood trees offered shade and privacy. The river flowed lazily here, its waters reflecting the fiery colors of the sunset. "We'll camp here tonight," Eli said as he set the brake and jumped down from the wagon. "It's not safe to be on the road after dark, not with Crow likely sending men after us." Lila's head snapped up. "You think he'll come after us?" Eli began unhitching the horses. "Men like Silas Crow don't take humiliation well, and I did more than humiliate him. I threatened his livelihood." He glanced at her. "But we've got a good head start, and I know this country better than he does." As Eli tended to the horses, Lila made her way to the river's edge. She knelt on the bank and gingerly submerged her wrists in the cool water, wincing as it stung the raw flesh. But the relief that followed was worth the momentary pain. She splashed water on her face, washing away days of grime and fear. When she looked up, Eli was standing a respectful distance away, holding out a clean shirt and a small tin of salve. "It's not much," he said, "but it'll help with those rope burns." Lila accepted both items with a nod of thanks. "I'll just—" She glanced around for somewhere private to change. "I'll get a fire started," Eli said, understanding her unspoken concern. He turned and walked back toward the wagon, giving her the privacy she needed. By the time Lila returned to the campsite wearing Eli's shirt that hung like a tent on her slender frame, he had a small fire crackling cheerfully. The smell of coffee brewing in a battered tin pot made her stomach growl audibly. Eli didn't comment on the sound, but he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a package wrapped in oilcloth. "It's not much," he said again, as he unwrapped bread and dried beef. "But it's better than nothing." Lila sat cross-legged by the fire and accepted the simple meal with hands that no longer trembled. As hunger overtook caution, she ate quickly, barely tasting the food. "Slow down," Eli advised. "There's plenty more." Lila forced herself to take smaller bites. As her desperate hunger eased, she began to feel more human again. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the riverbank, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe she might actually survive. "You're not what I expected," she said finally, accepting a cup of strong black coffee. Eli raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" "I don't know." Lila stared into her cup. "Men who buy women usually want something in return." "I didn't buy you," Eli corrected her. "I paid $1 to stop a bad thing, not to start another." He sipped his coffee, looking out over the river. "You don't owe me anything." Lila studied him over the rim of her cup. In the firelight, the lines on his face seemed deeper, etching a map of hard years and harder decisions. She noticed for the first time a thin leather cord around his neck, disappearing beneath his shirt. She wondered what hung on the end of it, but knew better than to ask. "My name is Lila Burns," she said instead, offering the simple dignity of her full name. "I was a school teacher in Boston." Eli nodded. "Eli McKenna. I raise cattle near Cimarron." How did I end up here? Lila asked, more to herself than to him. A month ago, I was teaching children to read. Now I'm, her voice faltered. Now you're free, Eli finished for her. Whatever brought you here, whatever happened to you, it's done. Tomorrow you start over. Is it that simple? Lila asked, a bitter edge to her voice. No, Eli admitted. It's never simple, but it's possible. He set his coffee down and reached inside his shirt, pulling out the folded paper with Silas's signature. This is your protection now. It proves Crow was engaged in an illegal trade. No court in the territory would return you to him. Not with this evidence. Lila stared at the paper, understanding dawning. You never intended to keep me. You planned this from the beginning. Eli shrugged. Crow needed to be stopped. You needed to be free. The law provided a way for both. You're not just a rancher, Lila said slowly. Sheriff Matthews said something about you hunting men for money. A shadow crossed Eli's face. He was silent for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. That was a long time ago, he finally said. After the war, I worked as a bounty hunter. Tracked criminals, army deserters, men who needed finding. His voice was flat, emotionless. I don't do that anymore. What made you stop? Lila asked quietly. Eli's hand moved to his belt, to the small leather pouch. Some prices are too high, he said cryptically, even for justice. Before Lila could press further, Eli stood abruptly. You should get some sleep. I'll take first watch. You think we're being followed? Alarm crept back into Lila's voice. It's just a precaution, Eli reassured her, but his eyes scanned the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight with practiced intensity. We've got a long ride tomorrow. Lila wanted to ask where they were going, what would happen to her now, but she recognized the closed expression on Eli's face. Whatever openness had existed between them moments ago had vanished like morning mist under the harsh sun. She made a bed of blankets in the wagon while Eli checked his rifle and pistol by the firelight. As she settled down to sleep, Lila realized she felt safe for the first time in weeks. Not because she trusted Eli McKenna, she didn't know him well enough for that, but because she sensed in him a rigidity of purpose, a moral stubbornness that would not bend easily. Whether that would be enough to protect them from whatever was coming remained to be seen. In Dodge City, the Golden Nugget Saloon hummed with the usual evening activities, poker games, working girls, cowboys spending their pay on watered-down whiskey. But in a back room, away from curious eyes and loose tongues, a different kind of business was being conducted. Sheriff Wade Matthews sat across from Silas Crow, both men nursing glasses of the saloon's best bourbon, not the rot gut served to regular customers. Matthews' jowly face was flushed with anger, and he jabbed a thick finger against the scarred wooden table. You signed a confession, you goddamn fool, he growled. A confession to human trafficking. Do you have any idea what that means? Silas knocked back his drink and poured another with an unsteady hand. How was I supposed to know what he was doing? He said, sign this, so I signed it. Because you're a greedy bastard who doesn't think, Matthews snapped. McKenna played you like a fiddle, and now he's got enough evidence to hang you, and possibly me, by association. So what do we do? Silas asked, fear finally beginning to penetrate his alcohol-numbed brain. Matthews leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. We get that paper back, and we make sure neither McKenna nor the girl can testify against us. He drained his glass. I know some men who can help. The Thorne brothers. They're up near Cimarron, not far from McKenna's ranch. Silas paled. The Thornes? They're killers, Wade. That's exactly what we need right now, Matthews said coldly. Killers. At that moment, a knock came at the door. Matthews nodded to Silas, who drew his pistol before calling, come in. The door opened to reveal James Harrington, the town lawyer. He looked out of place in the seedy back room with his tailored suit and wire-rimmed spectacles. He surveyed the scene with obvious distaste. Gentlemen, he said dryly, I hope I'm not interrupting anything illegal. Again, Matthews glowered at him. What do you want, Harrington? I merely came to inform you that I've sent a telegram to the territorial governor regarding today's events, Harrington said, adjusting his spectacles. I felt it important that the proper authorities be notified of a public attempt at human trafficking in our fair town. Matthews rose from his chair so quickly it toppled backward. You did what? He snarled. his hand moving to his gun. Harrington didn't flinch. "I'm an officer of the court, Sheriff. It's my duty to report crimes, especially federal ones." His eyes flicked meaningfully to Silas. "I also mentioned Mr. Crow by name. I'm sure the governor will be most interested in his business practices." "You smug son of a bitch," Silas spat, half rising from his seat. Harrington raised an eyebrow. "Careful, Mr. Crow. Threatening a lawyer is ill-advised, even in Dodge City." Matthews stepped between them, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "Get out, Harrington. Whatever game you're playing, you'd best remember who runs this town." "That's precisely what I'm concerned about," Harrington replied coolly. He tipped his hat mockingly. "Good evening, gentlemen. I'd advise against leaving town. The federal marshals tend to frown on that." As the door closed behind Harrington, Matthews let out a string of curses that would have made even the saloon's hardened prostitutes blush. "We've got bigger problems now," he muttered, pacing the small room. "If the governor sends marshals—" He trailed off, his mind racing. "We need to move fast," Silas said, his voice shaking. "Find McKenna and the girl tonight, before word spreads." Matthews shook his head. "They've got too much of a head start. But I know where McKenna's heading, back to his ranch, and I know a faster route." He grabbed his hat from the table. "I'm going to send a telegram of my own, to the Thorne brothers. Then we'll ride out at first light." "What about Harrington?" Silas asked. Matthews' face darkened. "Leave him to me. By the time he realizes his telegram never reached the governor, it'll be too late for him, too." As the two men made their hurried plans, neither noticed the small, hunched figure that slipped away from the door where he'd been listening. Tommy Wallace, a 14-year-old orphan who swept floors at the Golden Nugget for meals and a place to sleep, had heard every word. And Tommy had a decision to make, one that would shape the fate of Eli McKenna, Lila Burns, and everyone involved in the gathering storm. Dawn broke over the Kansas prairie in a spectacular display of orange and gold. Eli McKenna had been awake for hours, watching the eastern sky lighten from his position beneath a cottonwood tree. He'd spent most of the night on watch, catching only brief moments of sleep. Years as a bounty hunter had taught him to function on little rest, and old habits died hard. Lila stirred in the wagon, sitting up and rubbing sleep from her eyes. For a moment, confusion clouded her face as she tried to remember where she was. Then reality settled in, and she looked around until she spotted Eli. "You should have woken me," she said, climbing down from the wagon. "I could have taken a watch." Eli didn't answer. He was focused on saddling the horses, his movements efficient and practiced. His rifle lay within easy reach, and Lila noticed he'd reloaded his pistol as well. "You're expecting trouble," she stated rather than asked. "Always expect trouble," Eli replied. "That way you're either prepared or pleasantly surprised." He tightened the cinch on one of the horses and finally looked up at her. "How are your wrists?" Lila examined them. The salve had helped. The angry red welts had subsided to a dull soreness. "Better," she said. Eli nodded and returned to his tasks, checking the wagon's wheels and axle with critical eyes. "Where are we going?" Lila asked, pouring herself coffee from the pot Eli had already prepared. "Fort Union, New Mexico territory," Eli said. "There's a telegraph there. You can wire your family in Boston. Let them know you're safe." "And then what?" The question was quiet but loaded with uncertainty. Eli straightened up from his inspection of the wagon. "That's up to you. The stage runs from Fort Union to Santa Fe, and from there back east if that's where you want to go." He paused. "Or you could stay in the territory, start over. Teachers are scarce out here." Lila sipped her coffee, considering. "And what about Silas and Sheriff Matthews?" A grim smile touched Eli's lips briefly. "With luck, they'll be facing a federal judge before the month is out." He gestured to his saddlebag. "That signed paper is all the evidence needed to prosecute them both." "And if they come after us before then?" Eli's hand dropped instinctively to his holster. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes." They broke camp quickly after a simple breakfast of coffee and more dried beef. As Eli helped Lila into the wagon, he noticed her hands were steady now, her movements more assured. There was a resilience to her that he admired. Not many women would recover their composure so quickly after what she'd endured. "I need to know what happened to you," Eli said as he climbed up beside her. "Not out of curiosity, but for your protection. Crow might not be the only one looking for you." Lila was silent as Eli set the wagon in motion, heading southwest toward the distant mountains. The morning sun warmed her face, and she took a deep breath of the clean prairie air before beginning her story. I came west because my cousin William, Senator William Burns of Massachusetts, asked me to, she said. He's investigating human trafficking in the territories, particularly of women brought to work in mining camps and cattle towns. Eli glanced at her sharply. You're a senator's cousin? And Crow didn't know this when he took you? Lila shook her head. I wasn't supposed to be in danger. I was to be an observer only, working as a school teacher in Santa Fe while gathering information for William. Her voice hardened. But someone betrayed me. I was abducted from the stagecoach before I even reached New Mexico. Silas was only the latest man to own me. Eli's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Did you learn anything about who's behind the trafficking? Only bits and pieces, Lila said. The men who took me were careful, but I overheard things, a name, the judge, who seems to be directing operations from somewhere in the territories. And I know Sheriff Matthews is deeply involved. The judge, Eli repeated thoughtfully. That could be several men. Territorial judges wield a lot of power out here. He frowned. Do you think your cousin's investigation stirred up this hornet's nest? It must have, Lila said. The timing is too coincidental. William received anonymous information about the trafficking network, and weeks later I was targeted. She looked at Eli intently. The real question is, who would have the power to orchestrate all this? To corrupt law enforcement across territories? To know about a senator's private investigation? Eli didn't answer immediately. His mind was working through the implications, connecting dots from his own past as a bounty hunter. He'd tracked criminals across these territories for years, seen the corruption that festered in boomtowns and remote outposts. But this suggested something more organized, more far-reaching than the usual frontier lawlessness. We need to get you to Fort Union, he finally said. Your cousin needs to know what's happened, and the federal marshals need to be alerted. Lila nodded, then hesitated. What about you? When we reach Fort Union, I'll deliver you safely, then head back to my ranch, Eli said matter-of-factly. I've got cattle to tend to. That's it? Lila couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. After everything that's happened? Eli's face remained impassive. I did what needed doing in Dodge. Justice will take its course from here. But as the wagon rolled steadily southwest, neither of them truly believed it would be that simple. The weight of the signed paper in Eli's saddlebag, the knowledge in Lila's head, these things had value. And in the territories, valuable things rarely remained unchallenged for long. Behind them, though they couldn't yet see it, a dust cloud rose on the horizon, riders pushing their horses hard, following their trail. And to the west, in the shadows of the distant mountains, other eyes watched and waited for their approach. The game was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. They had been traveling for hours, the wagon swaying gently as it followed the winding trail through the tall grass. The morning sun had given way to the harsh glare of midday, and heat shimmered above the endless prairie like ghostly dancers. Eli kept the horses at a steady pace, not pushing them too hard in the growing heat. Speed was important, but so was preserving the animal's strength for what might come. Lila sat beside him, her borrowed shirt now covered by a faded shawl Eli had found among his supplies. She had tied her dark hair back with a strip of cloth, and the worst of the dust had been washed from her face at their brief stops by streams and waterholes. Already she looked less like a victim and more like a frontier woman, resilient, watchful, self-contained. Tell me about your ranch, she said, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between them. Eli glanced at her, then returned his gaze to the horizon. Not much to tell. 200 acres in Cimarron Valley, 50 head of cattle, a small house, a good barn, enough water most years. You live there alone? Lila asked carefully. Eli nodded once, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. My wife Margaret died 7 years ago. Cholera. The words were flat, factual, stripped of emotion. Our son James never came back from the war. Vicksburg. Lila absorbed this information quietly. It explained much about the man beside her, the solitude he wore like armor, the sense of contained grief that seemed to surround him like an invisible cloak. I'm sorry, she said simply. Eli acknowledged her words with a slight inclination of his head, but offered nothing more. His hand drifted briefly to the small leather pouch at his belt, a gesture Lila had noticed several times since their journey began. "What do you keep in there?" she asked, nodding toward the pouch. For a moment, she thought she'd overstepped. Eli's face closed even further, the lines around his mouth deepening. But then, to her surprise, he loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his palm. A simple gold band gleamed in the sunlight. "Margaret's wedding ring," he said, his voice low. "I couldn't bear to bury it with her." Lila studied the ring but didn't reach for it. She understood instinctively that this was as close as Eli McKenna came to sharing his heart with a stranger. "It's beautiful," she said. Eli nodded again, returning the ring to its pouch with reverent care. She was a fine woman, too good for the life I gave her. Before Lila could respond, Eli straightened suddenly in his seat, his entire demeanor changing. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon behind them. "What is it?" Lila asked, alarm tightening her voice. "Dust," Eli said tersely. "Riders coming fast." He reached for his spyglass, extending it with practiced ease and focusing on the distant cloud of dust. After a moment, he collapsed the glass with a grim expression. "4 men, moving hard." "Crow's men?" Lila's hands twisted nervously in her lap. "Probably." Eli clicked to the horses, urging them to a faster pace. "We're still a day's ride from the New Mexico border, and at least 3 from Fort Union." Lila turned to look behind them, though she could see nothing yet with her naked eye. "Can we outrun them?" "Not in a wagon, not across open country." Eli's mind was working rapidly, considering and discarding options. "There's an old line shack about 5 miles ahead, used by cowboys during spring roundups. We might find some supplies there, maybe shelter until dark. And if they catch us before then?" Eli's hand moved to the rifle beside him. "Then we fight." The simplicity of his answer sent a chill through Lila despite the heat of the day. This wasn't Boston with its police officers and courts of law. Out here, survival often came down to the most primitive equation: kill or be killed. Eli pushed the horses harder now, the wagon jolting as it crossed the uneven ground. Lila held tight to the seat, trying to keep her balance. Her wrists throbbed where the ropes had bitten into them, a physical reminder of what awaited her if they were caught. "Can you shoot?" Eli asked abruptly. Lila looked at him in surprise. No, I've never even held a gun." "Time to learn." Eli handed her his pistol, a well-maintained Colt with worn grips that spoke of years of use. "It's loaded, 6 rounds. Hold it firmly, aim by looking down the barrel, and squeeze the trigger gently. Don't pull it." Lila took the gun gingerly, startled by its weight and the cold feel of the metal. "I don't know if I could actually shoot someone." "When the moment comes, you'll know," Eli said grimly. "It's better to have the choice than not." They rode in tense silence, the line shack now visible as a dark speck against the golden prairie. Behind them, the dust cloud grew larger, the riders gaining ground with every passing minute. "They'll be on us before we reach the shack," Lila said, her voice steadier than she felt. Eli nodded, his face set in lines of determination. "Then we make our stand here." He pulled the wagon to a halt beside a small rise, nothing more than a gentle swell in the prairie, but the only cover available. "Get down, behind the wagon. Keep your head low." Lila scrambled down, the pistol clutched in her hand, while Eli quickly unhitched the horses. He slapped them away, sending them galloping toward the distant line shack. Then he grabbed his rifle and extra ammunition from beneath the wagon seat. "Why did you do that?" Lila asked, watching the horses disappear. "No sense in letting good horses be shot," Eli replied matter-of-factly. "And it might buy us time. They'll see the horses and think we're running on foot." He joined her behind the wagon, his movements calm and methodical as he checked his rifle. "What are our chances?" Lila asked, trying to keep her voice from trembling. Eli glanced at her, and something in his weathered face softened momentarily. "Better than you might think. I've faced worse odds." He positioned himself at the corner of the wagon, rifle ready. "Remember what I told you about that pistol, and don't shoot unless you have to. Every bullet counts out here." The riders were close enough now that Lila could make out individual figures. 4 men on horseback, pushing their mounts ruthlessly across the prairie. As they drew nearer, Eli studied them through his spyglass again. "Not Crow," he said with a frown. "Not Matthews either." He focused the glass more carefully. The Thorne brothers, he said finally, a new tension in his voice. Luther and Ezra, the other two I don't recognize. Who are the Thorns? Lila asked, though something in Eli's tone told her she already knew the answer. Killers, Eli said flatly. Bounty hunters sometimes, hired guns other times. We crossed paths during the war. They fought for the Confederacy. I was Union. His jaw tightened. They don't take kindly to losing, and they've lost to me more than once. The implications hung in the air between them. This wasn't just about recapturing Lila or retrieving the incriminating document. This was personal. What do we do? Lila whispered, the gun suddenly feeling inadequate in her inexperienced hands. We hold our ground, Eli said firmly. When they're in range, I'll try to reason with them first. Money can sometimes turn men like that around. But the grim set of his mouth suggested he didn't believe his own words. The Thorne brothers hadn't ridden all this way for money. They'd come for blood. The riders slowed as they approached, spreading out in a wide arc that would allow them to surround the wagon. They stopped just out of easy rifle range, clearly assessing the situation. "McKenna," a voice called across the prairie. "Send out the woman and throw down that paper, and maybe we'll let you live." Luther Thorne, Eli muttered, always did talk too much. He raised his voice to call back. "You know that's not going to happen, Luther. Ride away now and we'll forget we saw each other." A harsh laugh was the only response. Then the four riders spurred their horses forward, closing the distance rapidly, guns drawn. Eli's rifle cracked, the sound shockingly loud in the open prairie. One of the unknown riders tumbled from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. "Keep your head down," Eli shouted to Lila as he worked the lever of his Winchester, chambering another round. He fired again, missing Luther but causing the riders to veer away, seeking cover where there was none. Bullets whined overhead, thudding into the wagon or throwing up spurts of dust nearby. Lila pressed herself against the wagon wheel, her heart hammering in her chest. Eli fired methodically, his face a mask of concentration. Another rider fell, clutching his chest. But the Thorne brothers were experienced fighters. They split up, one circling to each side of the wagon, looking for an angle of attack. "Lila," Eli said urgently, "when I move to the other side of the wagon, you need to watch this side. Can you do that?" She nodded, though terror nearly froze her in place. Eli slipped around the back of the wagon, his movements quick and sure despite his age. Lila raised her pistol with shaking hands, pointing it toward where Luther Thorne might appear. A shadow fell across her, and she looked up to see Ezra Thorne standing over her, a cruel smile on his scarred face. He dismounted and approached silently from behind while they were focused on his brother. "Well, well," he drawled, his pistol aimed at her head. "What's a pretty thing like you doing out here with old Eli? Don't you know he's got a habit of getting women killed?" Lila's finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could fire, a shot rang out. Ezra's smile froze, then collapsed as blood blossomed on his chest. He toppled forward, nearly falling on top of Lila. Eli stood behind him, smoke still curling from his pistol barrel. "Move," he shouted, pulling Lila to her feet. They barely made it to the other side of the wagon when Luther Thorne opened fire, bullets splintering the wood where they had been moments before. "Run for the line shack," Eli ordered, pressing his pistol into her hand again. "I'll cover you." "I won't leave you," Lila protested. "This isn't a debate," Eli growled. "Go, now!" He pushed her toward the distant building, then turned and fired his rifle at Luther, forcing the man to take cover behind his fallen horse. Lila hesitated only a moment longer before gathering her skirts and running. The prairie grass whipped against her legs, and the sun beat down mercilessly on her unprotected head. Behind her, she heard the crack of Eli's rifle, the answering shots from Luther Thorne, and then a sound that made her blood run cold. Silence. She stopped and turned, gasping for breath. The wagon was 100 yards behind her now, but she could see two figures locked in desperate hand-to-hand combat beside it. Eli and Luther, their guns apparently empty or discarded, fighting with the savagery of wolves. Lila started back toward them, the pistol clutched in her hand, but she was too far away to help. All she could do was watch as the two men, one aging but still powerful, the other younger and fueled by hate, struggled for supremacy. Luther landed a heavy blow to Eli's face, sending the older man staggering backward. Luther followed up, knife suddenly gleaming in his hand. Eli barely avoided the slash, catching Luther's wrist and turning the blade aside. But Luther was stronger, fresher. He bore down, forcing Eli to his knees, the knife inching closer to the older man's throat. Lila raised the pistol, trying to steady her aim, as Eli had taught her. The two men were tangled together, moving constantly. If she fired, she might hit Eli instead of Luther. Please, she whispered, though whether to get her fate or the gun itself, she couldn't have said. Please. She squeezed the trigger, the pistol bucked in her hand, nearly flying from her grip. The report echoed across the prairie. Both men froze, then Luther Thorne slowly toppled sideways, a neat hole in his temple. Eli remained on his knees for a long moment, chest heaving, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. Then he rose unsteadily to his feet and turned toward Lila, who stood rooted in place, the smoking gun still extended before her. He crossed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. When he reached her, he gently took the pistol from her rigid fingers. You did what you had to do, he said quietly. No more, no less. Lila stared at her empty hands, then at the man she'd killed. I've never, she began, but the words stuck in her throat. I know. Eli's voice was as close to gentle as she'd heard it. The first one stays with you. But remember this, if you hadn't pulled that trigger, I'd be dead now, and you'd be on your way back to Dodge or worse. The simple truth of his words penetrated the haze of shock surrounding her. She had killed a man, yes, but in doing so, she had saved another, and herself. We need to move, Eli said, practical as always. There might be more following. They gathered what supplies they could salvage from the wagon, including the precious document with Silas Crow's signature. Eli found one of the outlaw's horses that hadn't run off, a sturdy chestnut gelding that could carry them both at a pinch. As they prepared to leave, Lila looked back at the bodies scattered across the peaceful prairie. Shouldn't we bury them? Eli shook his head. No time, the prairie will do it for us. He looked up at the circling buzzards already gathering overhead. Unknown to either man, in the darkness outside the telegrapher's window, a small figure crouched beneath the sill, listening intently to every word. Tommy Wallace, the orphan boy from the Golden Nugget, had followed the sheriff and Crow through town, driven by a curiosity that might just prove fatal if he were discovered. But Tommy had survived on Dodge City streets by being invisible when necessary, and tonight was no exception. As Matthews and Crow concluded their business and prepared to leave, Tommy slipped away into the darkness, his young mind racing with the implications of what he'd heard. Judge Roland Blackwood, Senator Burns, Fort Union. The names and places meant little to Tommy, but he understood the gist of what was happening. The nice lady he'd seen at the stockyard yesterday was in danger, and so was the tall, grim-faced man who had saved her. Tommy hesitated at the corner of Front Street, weighing his options. Eli stood in the doorway watching the sunrise with the patient vigilance of a man who had learned long ago that beauty and danger often arrived hand in hand. He had slept little during the night, taking only brief moments of rest while Lila kept watch. His side ached where Luther Thorne's knife had found him, but he'd endured worse pain in his time. Behind him, Lila stirred on the narrow cot. She had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep just before dawn, the Colt pistol still clutched in her hand. Eli had gently removed it once her breathing deepened, knowing she needed rest more than she needed a weapon at that moment. She sat up now, blinking in the early light, her face momentarily confused before memory returned. Her hand went automatically to the empty space beside her, searching for the gun. On the table, Eli said without turning. I cleaned it while you slept. Lila nodded, brushing tangled hair from her face. Did you see anything out there? Nothing but prairie. Eli stepped back inside, closing the door. But that doesn't mean we're safe. The Thorns weren't working alone. Whoever sent them will send others when they don't return. Lila's shoulders sagged slightly at his words. She had hoped, perhaps, that the worst was behind them. Now she understood that their journey had only begun. We need to reach Fort Union, she said, determination replacing fatigue in her voice. My cousin needs to know what's happening. The federal marshals need to be alerted. Eli nodded, appreciating her resolve. The horse should be rested enough to carry us both for a while. We'll alternate walking to spare him. If we push hard, we... Up to gun. We might reach the New Mexico border by nightfall. They broke their fast with the meager supplies they'd salvaged, jerky, hardtack, and water from their canteens. Neither spoke much as they prepared to leave, each lost in private thoughts about what lay ahead. As Eli saddled the horse, his practiced hands moving with automatic efficiency, Lila stood in the doorway of the shack, taking a final look at the humble shelter that had protected them through the night. In Boston, she would have considered such accommodations primitive, even squalid. Now she recognized it for what it truly was, a haven, a place of safety in a landscape as beautiful as it was merciless. "We should get moving," Eli said, leading the horse to her. "The trail through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains is rough going. I'd like to reach it before dark if we can." Lila nodded and allowed him to help her mount. As they set off, the rising sun at their backs, she found herself studying Eli's profile with new eyes. Yesterday, she had killed a man to save him. The act had forged a bond between them that transcended their brief acquaintance. "Tell me about your life as a bounty hunter," she said as they rode, her voice cutting through the morning stillness. Eli glanced at her, surprise momentarily breaking through his stoic expression. "Not much to tell that you'd want to hear." "I want to understand," Lila persisted. "Yesterday I took a man's life. I need to know what kind of world I've stepped into." Eli was silent for so long that Lila thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, each word carefully chosen. "After the war, there wasn't much work for men who knew nothing but fighting. Bounty hunting paid well if you were good at it, and I was. Tracked deserters, murderers, stagecoach robbers." His mouth tightened. "I told myself I was serving justice, bringing in men who deserved punishment. And maybe that was true at first. But it changed," Lila prompted gently. "Everything changes," Eli said. "The lines blur. You start out hunting guilty men, then one day you realize you're just hunting men for money." His eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "I quit 5 years ago, after a job went wrong. Tracked a man named Harlow for weeks, finally cornered him in a cabin near the Colorado border. There was a woman with him. I didn't know that." Lila felt a chill despite the warming day. "What happened?" "Harlow used her as a shield. I shot through her to get to him." Eli's voice was flat, emotionless, but the pain in his eyes told a different story. "She was innocent, just in the wrong place. I got my bounty, but the cost was too high." Lila absorbed this in silence. She understood now why Eli had been so determined to save her in Dodge City, why he continued to risk his life to bring her safely to Fort Union. He was seeking redemption, one soul at a time. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Eli nodded once, acknowledging her words without turning them aside. Then, with the practiced skill of a man accustomed to leaving painful topics behind, he changed the subject. "Tell me more about this investigation of your cousin's. What exactly was Senator Burns hoping to uncover?" Lila welcomed the shift, grateful to focus on something beyond the violence they'd both experienced. "William began receiving anonymous letters last year," she explained. "Detailed accounts of women and children being trafficked through the territories, particularly to mining camps and cattle towns. The letters mentioned names, judges, sheriffs, even a few congressmen, who were supposedly involved. And he sent you to investigate?" Eli's voice held a note of disapproval. "Seems reckless, putting his own cousin in harm's way." "It was my idea," Lila countered. "I've always been independent. After my husband died in '73, I had no desire to remarry or continue the quiet life of a Boston widow. When William mentioned the letters, I volunteered." She shook her head ruefully. "I thought my teaching credentials would provide the perfect cover for asking questions in Santa Fe. But you never made it there." "No." The stagecoach was stopped a day outside of Dodge, men with bandanas over their faces. "They took me and one other woman, a girl, really, no more than 17. Her name was Emma." Lila's voice caught. "I don't know what happened to her." Eli's face hardened. "These men, did they say anything that might identify them or who they worked for?" "They were careful, but I overheard them talking when they thought I was asleep. They mentioned the judge several times and how he wouldn't be pleased if the merchandise was damaged." Lila's mouth twisted at the memory. "They also mentioned something called the Association, like it was some kind of organization." Eli frowned thoughtfully. "The judge could be several men. There's Judge Whitaker in Dodge, Judge Pelham in Denver. He paused. But if this goes as high as congressman, we might be looking at a federal judge, someone with real power. The question is why, Lila asked. Why risk so much to traffic people when there are so many legal ways to make money out here? Power, Eli said simply. Control over human lives is the oldest form of power there is. And once you have a taste for it, gold and land aren't enough anymore. The chilling assessment hung between them as they continued their journey, the vast prairie gradually giving way to rolling foothills. By midday, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains loomed before them, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. Eli dismounted to lead the horse, saving its strength for the steeper terrain ahead. Lila walked beside him, her city-bred feet growing more accustomed to the uneven ground with each passing hour. We're being followed, Eli said suddenly, his voice calm but his body tensing. Lila fought the urge to spin around and look. How do you know? Dust on the horizon, moving with purpose. Eli didn't break stride or turn his head, but his right hand drifted closer to his holster. Could be nothing. Could be something. Either way, we need to reach those mountains. They quickened their pace, Eli's long strides forcing Lila to almost jog to keep up. The foothills were closer now, the landscape changing from open prairie to scattered stands of pine and juniper. Better cover, Eli thought, if it came to another confrontation. By late afternoon, they had reached the first real slopes of the mountains. Eli led them off the main trail, following a narrower path that wound between massive boulders and ancient pines. The air grew cooler as they climbed, carrying the scent of resin and wild mint. There's a place up ahead, Eli said, his breathing steady despite the exertion. An old Spanish mission, abandoned for years. We can shelter there tonight. And our pursuers, Lila asked, not bothering to hide her concern. The trail forks about a mile back. If they're not familiar with these mountains, they might take the wrong path. Eli didn't sound particularly convinced by his own words. And if they don't, well, the mission has thick walls and only one entrance. Worse places to make a stand. The mission appeared before them as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. A small square building of adobe and stone, its bell tower partially collapsed, its wooden door hanging askew from rusted hinges. Wildflowers grew between cracks in the flagstone path that led to its entrance, and swallows nested in the eaves of what had once been the priest's quarters. It's beautiful, Lila murmured, surprising herself with the observation. Eli nodded. Spaniards built it in the 17s, then abandoned it when the Comanches pushed them back. The Comanches left it alone, though, respected it as a holy place, even if it wasn't their god being worshipped inside. He helped Lila dismount, then led the horse to a small corral beside a spring-fed stream that bubbled from the mountainside. The mission's surroundings had been carefully chosen by those long-dead priests. Water, good grazing, a commanding view of the valley below. Inside, the mission was a single room with a stone altar at one end. Faded paintings of saints adorned the walls, their faces gentle despite the peeling paint. Wooden benches lined the sides, and a trapdoor in the floor suggested a cellar or crypt beneath. We should be safe enough here, Eli said, setting down his saddlebags. I'll gather some firewood before it gets dark. There's a fireplace in the back. Lila nodded, but her attention was caught by something on the altar. A small, leather-bound book. She moved closer, surprised to find an English Bible rather than the Spanish text she had expected. It was well-worn, its pages yellowed but intact. Someone's been here recently, she called to Eli, who was examining the trapdoor. This Bible can't have been here since Spanish times. Eli crossed to join her, frowning as he took the book. He flipped it open, and a folded piece of paper fell to the stone floor. Lila bent to retrieve it, unfolding what appeared to be a letter written in a careful, educated hand. It's dated last month, she said, scanning the contents with growing surprise. It's from someone named James Harrington, addressed to my dear friend Blue Hawk. Eli took the letter, his expression shifting from concern to thoughtful interest as he read. Harrington is the lawyer in Dodge City, the one who witnessed your sale. And Blue Hawk. He hesitated. Blue Hawk is a Jicarilla Apache, a scout I worked with years ago when I was still hunting bounties. A friend of yours? Lila asked. As close to one as I had in those days, Eli admitted. He saved my life more than once. He continued reading the letter, his frown deepening. According to this, Harrington has been investigating corruption in the territorial courts. He mentions the judge too, says he's getting close to identifying him. Eli looked up, his eyes sharp with new understanding. Harrington must have left this here for Blue Hawk as a dead drop, a way to share information without being seen together. So there are others investigating the same corruption we're caught in, Lila said, hope coloring her voice for the first time in days. Appears so. Eli carefully refolded the letter. But it doesn't change our immediate situation. We still need to reach Fort Union, and we're still being pursued. As if to emphasize his words, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed up from the valley below. Eli moved swiftly to the mission's single window, a narrow opening that provided a clear view of the winding trail they had ascended. 4 riders, he reported, his voice tight. Moving fast, they'll be here before sunset. Lila joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she spotted the approaching horseman. Is it Matthews? Crow? Can't tell from here, but whoever they are, they're not here by chance. Eli turned away from the window, his mind already shifting to defense. Help me barricade the door. Then we need to check what supplies are in that cellar. They worked quickly, moving one of the heavy wooden benches against the door. The trapdoor revealed a small cellar stocked with basic provisions, dried beans, flour, coffee, even a few bottles of Sacramento wine. More importantly, it contained a small arsenal, 2 rifles, a shotgun, and boxes of ammunition. Blue Hawk's been busy, Eli observed, examining one of the rifles with approval. These are new. Army issue. Why would an Apache have U.S. Army weapons? Lila asked, confused. Blue Hawk scouts for the Army sometimes, Eli explained, loading both rifles with practiced efficiency. Fort Union pays him well for information on Comanche movements. He handed one of the loaded rifles to Lila. Remember what I taught you yesterday? Aim for the center of the body, squeeze the trigger gently, breathe out as you fire. Lila took the weapon, no longer shocked by its weight or purpose. It was, she realized, simply a tool for survival in this harsh land. No different, in its way, from the school books that had been her tools in Boston. The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. Voices carried faintly through the thick walls, men discussing their approach. Eli positioned himself by the window, rifle ready, while Lila crouched behind the altar, her own weapon trained on the door. They're splitting up, Eli reported quietly. 2 coming to the front, 2 circling around back. He cursed under his breath. They know what they're doing. These aren't just hired guns. A voice called from outside, startlingly close. McKenna, we know you're in there. Send out the woman and the document, and you can ride away from this. Eli remained silent, his eyes never leaving the figures he could see through the narrow window. Last chance, McKenna, the voice called again. You're outnumbered and surrounded. There's no way out of those mountains except past us. When Eli still didn't respond, a shot rang out, splintering the wood around the window frame. He ducked back, stone dust settling on his shoulders. Who are they? Lila whispered from her position behind the altar. Not sure, Eli admitted. The one doing the talking is wearing a badge, but it's not Matthews. His face was grim. Whoever they are, they know my name, and they know about the document. Before Lila could respond, a barrage of gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into the wooden door and whistling through the narrow window. Eli returned fire with measured shots, conserving ammunition while making each bullet count. One of the attackers cried out, hit by Eli's careful aim. The gunfire paused momentarily, then resumed with increased fury. The wooden door began to splinter under the assault. They're going to break through, Lila called, her voice steady despite the danger. Eli fired twice more, then moved from the window to join her behind the altar. There's another way out, he said, gesturing to a small door half hidden behind the altar. Priests always had a back exit. This leads to a path up the mountain. But you said they have men at the back, Lila protested. They'll be focused on the main building. If we're quick and quiet, we might slip past them. Eli reached into his vest and pulled out the document with Silas Crow's signature, pressing it into Lila's hand. Take this. If we get separated, keep heading northeast. Fort Union is about 20 miles from here. Lila stared at him, sudden understanding dawning. You're going to stay behind, create a diversion. Eli didn't deny it. Someone has to hold them here while you get clear. No, Lila's voice was firm, surprising them both with its authority. We go together or not at all. I didn't shoot Luther Thorne to save your life just so you could throw it away a day later. Something flickered in Eli's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or reluctant respect. He opened his mouth to argue, but the mission's wooden door shuddered under a renewed assault, this time from what sounded like an axe or battering ram. We don't have time to debate, Lila pressed. You know these mountains, I don't. I need you alive, Eli McKenna. For a moment, they locked eyes across the dusty altar, two stubborn wills clashing amid the chaos of the attack. Then Eli nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin that conceded the point without wasting words. Stay close, he instructed, moving toward the hidden door, and be ready to run when I say. The priest's escape route was narrow and dark, a tunnel carved through the living rock of the mountain. Eli led the way, a small lantern from the cellar casting just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles. Behind them, they heard the mission's door finally give way, followed by angry shouts as the attackers discovered their quarry gone. The tunnel climbed steadily upward, the air growing thinner and colder with each step. After what seemed an eternity, they emerged onto a small ledge high above the mission. The sun had set, but the full moon provided enough light to see the figures moving below. 4 men, now gathered in front of the mission, gesturing angrily as they debated their next move. We need to keep moving, Eli whispered. They'll find the tunnel soon enough. He led Lila along a narrow game trail that skirted the mountain's face, climbing higher into the pine forest that covered its upper slopes. The trail was treacherous in the darkness, loose shale sliding underfoot, branches whipping at their faces as they passed. Despite the danger, Lila felt a strange exhilaration. In Boston, she had been constrained by society's expectations, her life laid out in predictable patterns of propriety and obligation. Even her decision to help Williams' investigation had been safe, planned, controlled. Now she was truly in the wilderness, both literally and figuratively. Her survival depended on her own courage and resourcefulness. And on the man who moved ahead of her like a shadow among shadows, his knowledge of this harsh land their greatest asset. They had been climbing for perhaps an hour when Eli suddenly stopped, his hand raised in warning. Lila froze, straining to hear what had alerted him. For several heartbeats, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant cry of a hunting owl. Then she heard it, the soft clink of metal on stone, the whispered curse of a man trying to move silently and failing. They're following our trail, Eli breathed, his mouth close to her ear. We need to split up. Lila started to protest, but Eli's grip on her arm tightened. I mean it this time. I'll lead them away, circle back to the north. You keep following this trail. It leads to an old hunting cabin. Wait for me there. And if you don't come? Lila asked, her voice barely audible. Eli pressed something into her hand, the leather pouch that had hung at his belt. Then take this to Fort Union. Find Blue Hawk. Tell him what happened. He'll help you. Before Lila could respond, Eli melted into the darkness, moving deliberately toward the sounds of pursuit. She stood frozen for a moment, the leather pouch clutched in her hand, torn between following his instructions and going after him. Practicality won. She had the document, and now, apparently, something else of value in the pouch. Her duty was clear. Get to Fort Union, alert the authorities, stop the trafficking network that had nearly claimed her life. Swallowing her fear, Lila continued along the trail, moving as quietly as her city-bred feet would allow. Behind her, she heard Eli's voice ring out, deliberately loud. Over here, boys! Come and get me if you've got the spine for it. Gunshots echoed through the mountain night, followed by the crash of men moving recklessly through underbrush. Lila quickened her pace, praying that Eli's gambit would work, that his knowledge of the terrain would give him the advantage over his pursuers. The hunting cabin appeared before her just as the moon reached its zenith, a small, sturdy structure built of logs and field stone, nearly invisible among the towering pines. Lila approached cautiously, rifle ready, remembering Eli's constant vigilance. The cabin was empty, dusty, but intact. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and crude furnishings, a table, chair, and narrow cot, provided basic comforts. Lila secured the door and sank onto the cot, her legs trembling with fatigue and fading adrenaline. Only then did she open the leather pouch Eli had given her. Inside was Margaret's wedding ring, just as she expected. But there was something else. A small brass key, its teeth worn smooth with age. Attached to the key was a scrap of paper bearing a single word in faded ink: redemption. Lila turned the key over in her palm, puzzled. What lock did it open? What secrets did it guard? And why had Eli entrusted it to her, along with his most precious possession? She was still pondering these questions when a soft knock sounded at the cabin door. Lila froze, rifle rising automatically toward the sound. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "A friend," came the reply, the voice deep and accented. "Eli McKenna sent me to find you." Lila moved cautiously to the door, keeping the rifle trained on it. "Show yourself at the window first." There was a moment of silence, then a face appeared at the small window beside the door, copper-skinned, weathered, with dark eyes that held both wisdom and wariness. A streak of gray ran through his long, black hair, and a scar bisected his left eyebrow. "My name is Blue Hawk," the man said, "and we don't have much time. Eli has been captured." Lila's heart sank, but she kept the rifle steady. "How do I know you're really Blue Hawk? That Eli really sent you?" The man's expression didn't change, but something like approval flickered in his eyes. "You learn quickly," he observed. "Eli carries a ring that belonged to his wife, Margaret. He keeps it in a pouch on his belt. He would have given it to you if he feared he wouldn't return." Slowly, Lila lowered the rifle and unbarred the door. Blue Hawk entered, his movements fluid and silent despite his age, which Lila guessed to be about 50. "They took him alive," Blue Hawk said without preamble. "4 men led by a deputy marshal from Santa Fe. But not a real marshal, I think." His mouth tightened. "A man who serves the judge." "You know about the judge?" Lila asked, surprise momentarily overriding her concern for Eli. Blue Hawk nodded. "For 2 years, I have helped Harrington gather evidence. The judge is Roland Blackwood, Chief Justice of the Territorial Supreme Court." His eyes were hard as obsidian. "He controls the trafficking network from Santa Fe to Kansas City. He has judges, lawmen, politicians in his pocket. And now he has Eli," Lila said, the full weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. "They're taking him to Santa Fe," Blue Hawk confirmed. "To Blackwood. They think he has evidence that could expose the entire operation." "This?" Lila held up the document with Silas Crow's signature. Blue Hawk shook his head. "That is nothing to them. A small fish. They want what Eli has kept hidden for 5 years." He pointed to the key in Lila's hand. "The evidence his wife gathered before she died. The names, the bank accounts, the shipments of women and children." His voice was grim. "The evidence that could bring down not just Blackwood, but senators, congressmen, even a governor or two." Lila stared at the innocuous key with new understanding. Eli's wife was investigating the trafficking network? Margaret McKenna was a clever woman, Blue Hawk said, respect evident in his tone. She worked as a clerk in the federal courthouse in Denver before she married Eli. She saw documents, heard conversations. She kept records. He met Lila's gaze steadily. When she fell ill, she gave everything to Eli, for safekeeping, for justice when the time was right. "And the key?" Lila asked, turning it over in her palm. "Opens a lockbox in the Denver First National Bank." Blue Hawk's expression was solemn. Eli never used it. He blamed himself for Margaret's death, believed she was poisoned because of what she knew. He put aside justice for vengeance, became a bounty hunter term to find her killers. "Did he?" Lila asked quietly. "Find them." "Some," Blue Hawk acknowledged, "but not the one who gave the order. Not Blackwood." He gestured to the key. Eli could never bring himself to use what Margaret died for. The guilt was too heavy. "Until now," Lila murmured, "until he met me and saw the same thing happening again." Blue Hawk nodded, something like sorrow crossing his weathered features. "Eli McKenna is a good man who has done bad things. Now he tries to balance the scales." "By sacrificing himself," Lila said, anger suddenly flaring through her concern. "By playing the martyr." "He sees no other way," Blue Hawk replied simply. "But perhaps there is one." He studied Lila with penetrating intensity. "You are not what I expected, Boston woman. There is fire in you. Enough to burn Blackwood's whole operation to the ground," Lila said with quiet determination. enough to save Eli and finish what Margaret started. She closed her fingers around the key. Decision made. How far is it to Denver? Blue Hawk's face remained impassive, but something like approval showed in his dark eyes. 3 days hard ride, but Blackwood's men will be watching the trails. Then we don't take the trails, Lila said firmly. You know these mountains. Get me to Denver, Blue Hawk, and I promise you, the judge will finally face true justice. Outside the cabin, a wolf howled in the distance, the sound echoing off the mountainsides like a promise or a warning. The night was deep, the path ahead uncertain. But for the first time since her ordeal began, Lila Burns felt something beyond fear or mere determination. She felt purpose, a sense of destiny that transcended her original mission for William. This was no longer about an investigation or even personal survival. This was about justice. For Margaret McKenna, for the nameless women and children trafficked across the territories, for Eli, who had risked everything to save a stranger, and perhaps, in some small way, for the woman Lila herself was becoming, stronger, braver, more certain of her own worth than she had ever been in the drawing rooms of Boston. Dawn was still hours away, but in Lila's heart, a new day had already begun. The journey to Denver was a brutal test of endurance. For 3 days, Lila and Blue Hawk traversed the most inhospitable terrain the Rockies could offer. Narrow game trails that clung to sheer cliff faces, icy streams that numbed the legs and stole the breath, dense forests where sunlight barely penetrated the ancient canopy. They traveled by night when possible, rested in hidden canyons during the day, and spoke little save for necessary instruction. Blue Hawk proved an invaluable guide. He moved through the wilderness with the easy confidence of a man navigating his own home, finding water where none seemed possible, spotting game trails invisible to Lila's untrained eye. Twice he detected Blackwood's men before they came into view, allowing them to slip away unseen. For Lila, each mile was both torment and revelation. Her feet blistered, then calloused. Her muscles screamed, then strengthened. Her city-bred sensibilities recoiled, then adapted to the harsh realities of survival in the wild. She learned to move quietly, to watch for signs of danger, to conserve her strength for when it was truly needed. And through it all, one thought sustained her. Eli McKenna, captured because he had chosen to save her. Eli, who carried the weight of his dead wife's mission like a cross upon his shoulders. Eli, whom she barely knew, yet felt connected to by bonds forged in blood and sacrifice. On the dawn of the 4th day, they crested a final ridge, and Denver spread below them, a sprawling frontier city nestled against the eastern slope of the mountains. Steam engines puffed at the railway station. Church spires rose above sturdy brick buildings, and the streets teemed with the commerce of a boomtown flush with silver and ambition. Civilization, Blue Hawk said, the word carrying a hint of irony in his accented English. He operated a small stable and way station on the eastern edge of Denver, catering to travelers of all backgrounds, with a pragmatic disregard for social divisions. He greeted Blue Hawk with a brief embrace and Lila with a curious but respectful nod. The woman needs clothes, Blue Hawk explained without preamble, and we need information about First National Bank. Yellowknife raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. He ushered them into his modest home where his Cheyenne wife, Mary, provided hot food and, more importantly, a bath and clean clothing for Lila. The simple dress and sturdy boots Mary offered were plain but respectable, the garb of a farmer's wife or shopkeeper's daughter, not a Boston lady of means. But Lila donned them with profound gratitude, feeling more human than she had in days. The bank closes at 3, Yellowknife informed them as they gathered around his kitchen table. Manager's name is Williams. Decent man for a banker. Doesn't turn Indians away if their money's good. He studied Lila thoughtfully. But he'll be suspicious of a woman trying to access a box, especially one registered to a man. I have the key, Lila said, touching the pouch where she carried it alongside Margaret's ring. And I have a story. I'm Eli McKenna's sister-in-law, Margaret's sister, come from Boston to settle family affairs. Yellowknife exchanged glances with Blue Hawk. Might work, but Blackwood's people will be watching the bank. They know what Eli had, what his wife gathered. Then we need a distraction, Lila said firmly. The days of hard travel had burned away any hesitation in her nature, leaving behind a core of steely resolve. Something to draw their attention elsewhere while I accessed the lockbox. Blue Hawk nodded slowly. I know some men, Arapaho and Cheyenne, who have grievances against the territorial court. They would enjoy creating problems for Blackwood's watchers. A plan began to take shape around Yellowknife's scarred oak table. By midday, it was set in motion, roles assigned, contingencies accounted for. Lila would enter the bank at precisely 2 o'clock, when the afternoon crowd was at its height. Blue Hawk's indigenous allies would create a disturbance several blocks away, drawing attention from any watchers. Yellowknife himself would wait with a fast horse in the alley behind the bank. And if it all goes wrong, Mary asked quietly, the first words she had spoken in Lila's presence. Then I use this, Lila replied, drawing Eli's pistol from the pocket Mary had sewn into the dress, and take as many of them with me as I can. The native woman's eyes widened slightly, then crinkled with something like approval. You have changed, city woman. The mountains have remade you. Lila considered this as she tucked the gun away. Had she changed? Or had circumstances simply revealed a strength that had always existed beneath the veneer of Boston propriety? Either way, she no longer recognized the cautious schoolteacher who had boarded that fateful stagecoach weeks ago. That woman would never have contemplated violence, let alone planned for it. That woman would have waited for rescue, for men to solve her problems. That woman would never have understood what truly mattered in this harsh, beautiful, unforgiving land. At precisely 1:45, Lila set out for the First National Bank of Denver, a cloth parasol shielding her face from both sun and casual observation. She walked with the measured pace of a respectable woman on legitimate business, neither hurrying nor dawdling. Blue Hawk had already departed for his rendezvous with the Arapaho men. Yellowknife was making his way separately to the position behind the bank. Denver's streets bustled with the diverse humanity of a frontier boomtown. Miners with silver dust ground into their very skin, dandified gamblers in fancy waistcoats, hard-eyed businessmen, painted ladies beginning their afternoon strolls, Chinese laborers, Mexican traders, and everywhere the palpable sense of a place where fortunes were made and lost daily. As Lila approached the imposing stone edifice of First National Bank, she scanned the surroundings with the newfound vigilance of her journey. Across the street, a man in a bowler hat appeared to be reading a newspaper, but his eyes moved too frequently from the page. Near the bank's entrance, two men in dusty range clothes lounged with the artificial casualness of predators trying to appear harmless. Blackwood's men, without a doubt. Lila kept walking, counting silently in her head. If Blue Hawk's timing was correct, she had approximately 3 minutes before the distraction began. 3 minutes to somehow slip past the watchers and into the bank without arousing suspicion. She needn't have worried. As she drew within 30 feet of the entrance, a woman's scream pierced the afternoon bustle. Heads turned, including those of Blackwood's men, toward the sight of a young woman pointing in horror at a man who had apparently snatched her purse. The purse snatcher took off running, directly past the bank entrance. One of Blackwood's men, perhaps operating on instinct or seeking to maintain his cover as an ordinary citizen, lunged to intercept the thief. They collided spectacularly, tumbling into the street in a tangle of limbs and curses. The second watcher hesitated, torn between his duty to monitor the bank and the need to assist his companion. In that moment of indecision, Lila swept through the bank doors, heart pounding but outwardly composed. The interior was cool and imposing, with polished marble floors and mahogany counters designed to inspire confidence in the institution's stability. Tellers worked behind brass grills, counting stacks of notes and coins. A large clock on the wall showed 5 minutes to 2, right on schedule. Lila approached a young clerk who was not currently occupied with a customer. "I need to access a safety deposit box, please," she said, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her stomach. "It belongs to my brother-in-law, Eli McKenna." The clerk nodded. "Of course, ma'am. Do you have the key and the proper authorization?" Lila produced the key from her pocket. "My sister, Mr. McKenna's wife, passed away some years ago. I've come from Boston to help settle family affairs." She met the clerk's eyes directly. "Mr. McKenna asked me to retrieve specific papers from this box." The clerk hesitated, clearly uncertain about the protocol for such a situation. "Let me speak with Mr. Williams, the manager." As the clerk disappeared into a back office, Lila maintained her composed facade while scanning the bank interior. No sign of the watchers yet, but it was only a matter of time before they regrouped and realized she had entered the bank. The clerk returned with an older man whose silver hair and tailored suit marked him as someone of authority. "Mrs.?" he inquired politely. "Miss," Lila corrected. "Miss Rebecca Burns. My sister Margaret was Mr. McKenna's wife." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "I remember Mrs. McKenna, a fine woman, but I'm afraid bank policy requires the box holder's presence or a letter of authorization for family members to access a safety deposit box." Before Lila could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts, the sound of breaking glass, the distinctive crack of gunfire. Blue Hawk's distraction had escalated beyond a simple purse snatching. Williams frowned, glancing toward the windows at the front of the bank. "What in heaven's name?" Lila seized the moment of distraction. "Mr. Williams, I wouldn't ask if it weren't urgent. My brother-in-law is in grave danger. The papers in that box are his only protection against powerful men who wish him harm." She lowered her voice, infusing it with genuine emotion that wasn't entirely feigned. "Men who may have been responsible for my sister's death." Something in her earnestness, or perhaps simply the disruption outside, seemed to sway the manager. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded sharply. "Very well, Miss Burns. Given the circumstances, I'll make an exception. Please come with me." He led her through a heavy door into a windowless room lined with metal boxes of various sizes. Using his own key in conjunction with hers, he opened a medium-sized box near the bottom of one wall. "I'll give you privacy," he said, stepping back. "Please ring the bell when you're finished." He indicated a small bell on a nearby table. Once alone, Lila lifted the lid of the box with trembling hands. Inside was a packet wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, along with a folded letter addressed simply to Eli in a feminine hand that must have belonged to Margaret. Lila hesitated, torn between respect for this private message and the urgent need for information. Necessity 1. She opened the letter and scanned it quickly. "My dearest Eli," it began, "if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally decided to use what I discovered. The enclosed documents detail the entire operation, the trafficking routes, the payments, the buyers and sellers of human lives. Most importantly, they include proof of Judge Blackwood's involvement and the names of his political allies who protect him in exchange for payments and other considerations too vile to mention." The letter continued with personal messages of love and encouragement, ending with a plea. "Use this information wisely, my love. Not for vengeance, but for justice. That is all I have ever wanted." Lila carefully refolded the letter and tucked it into her pocket alongside the oilcloth packet. She rang the bell, and minutes later was walking out of the bank, the precious documents concealed beneath her shawl. The street outside had largely returned to normal, though a crowd still gathered a block away where Blue Hawk's distraction had occurred. Of Blackwood's watchers there was no sign. Either they had been drawn into the commotion, or they had spotted her entering the bank and were now waiting to follow her. Lila walked unhurriedly toward the agreed-upon rendezvous point, the alley behind the bank where Yellowknife waited with horses. She had nearly reached it when a hand closed around her arm, yanking her roughly into a narrow space between two buildings. She found herself face to face with the man in the bowler hat, his previous pose of casual observation replaced by naked menace. "Give me the papers, lady," he growled, "and maybe I won't hurt you too bad." Lila's hand moved toward her pocket, but instead of reaching for the documents, she grasped Eli's pistol. The man realized her intention a moment too late. The gun was already pressed against his ribs when his eyes widened in alarm. "I've killed better men than you," Lila said quietly, the truth of the statement giving her voice a deadly calm. "Walk away now and you might live to spend whatever Blackwood pays you." Fear flickered across the man's face, but greed or loyalty stiffened his resolve. His hand darted toward his own weapon. Lila fired. The sound was shockingly loud in the confined space between buildings. The man staggered backward, clutching his stomach, disbelief written across his features. He slumped against the wall, leaving a dark smear as he slid to the ground. Lila stepped past him without a backward glance, hurrying now toward the alley. Yellowknife was waiting, searched him, His expression shifting from concern to relief as she appeared. Any trouble? He asked, helping her mount one of the two waiting horses. Nothing I couldn't handle, Lila replied, tucking the gun back into her pocket. The cold efficiency of her actions should have disturbed her, but there was no time for moral reflection. We need to move. His partner will be looking for him soon. They rode out of Denver by a circuitous route Yellowknife had scouted earlier, avoiding main roads and potential checkpoints. By nightfall, they had reached a small hunting cabin deep in the foothills, where Blue Hawk waited with supplies for the journey ahead. You have the documents? He asked without preamble as they dismounted. Lila nodded, producing the oilcloth packet. Everything Margaret collected. Names, dates, amounts, enough to destroy Blackwood and his entire network. Blue Hawk's weathered face showed the first real smile Lila had seen from him. Then we have done well. Now we must get this to someone who can use it properly. My cousin, Senator Burns, Lila said firmly. But first, we need to help Eli. They're taking him to Santa Fe, to Blackwood. Blue Hawk and Yellowknife exchanged glances. That may be a problem, Yellowknife said slowly. Word in Denver is that Blackwood has called a special session of the territorial court, a trial for a dangerous criminal who attacked a federal marshal. Eli, Lila breathed, her blood running cold. They're going to use the legal system to kill him. A public execution sanctioned by law, Blue Hawk agreed grimly. It silences him permanently while reinforcing Blackwood's image as a man of justice. When? Lila demanded. When is this trial? 3 days from now, Yellowknife replied. They're rushing it through while public sentiment is inflamed by stories of McKenna's supposed crimes. Lila's mind raced. Santa Fe is at least 4 days' hard ride from here, even if we left now. For horses, yes, Blue Hawk said, a calculating look in his dark eyes. But the train is faster. The Denver and Rio Grande runs south to Pueblo, then connects to Santa Fe. With the right paperwork, we could be there in 2 days. What paperwork? Lila asked, confused. Blue Hawk smiled thinly. Think it's time Miss Rebecca Burns became someone with more authority. Perhaps a representative of the Department of Justice, investigating judicial misconduct in the territories. Yellowknife nodded approvingly. I know a man who creates excellent credentials, used to work for the Confederate government during the war, forging documents for spies. Now he makes papers for minors who want to claim they're American citizens. Lila looked between the two men, realization dawning. You're suggesting I impersonate a federal agent? Unless you have a better idea for getting close to Blackwood and into a heavily guarded courtroom, Blue Hawk replied with a shrug. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. If caught, she would face charges far more serious than anything Blackwood might have initially planned for her. Yet the alternative, allowing Eli to be publicly executed for the crime of trying to expose corruption, was unthinkable. Get me those papers, Lila said decisively, in appropriate clothing. If I'm going to be a federal agent, I need to look the part. While Yellowknife rode back to Denver to arrange the forged credentials, Blue Hawk and Lila spent the evening studying the documents Margaret McKenna had collected. The extent of the conspiracy was staggering. Not just human trafficking, but land fraud, bribery, election rigging, and murder, all overseen by Judge Roland Blackwood and protected by a network of corrupted officials from Kansas City to Santa Fe. Most damning were the financial records showing regular payments from Blackwood to 3 U.S. congressmen, a territorial governor, and over a dozen local officials. Margaret had been meticulous, noting dates, amounts, and the specific favors purchased with each payment. She was extraordinary, Lila murmured, awed by the courage and intelligence of the woman she would never meet. To gather all this while maintaining her cover as a simple court clerk. Margaret McKenna was a woman ahead of her time, Blue Hawk agreed. Like you. Lila looked up, surprised by the comparison. I'm just a school teacher who stumbled into this by accident. No, Blue Hawk contradicted her gently. You are a warrior who found her true path. I have watched you these past days. You adapt, you learn, you fight. When faced with death, you choose life, not just your own, but others. These are the marks of a true warrior. Lila fell silent, absorbing his words. There was truth in them, she realized. Something fundamental had shifted within her during this journey. The prim Boston school teacher seemed like a character in a novel she had once read. familiar but no longer quite real. "If we succeed," she said finally, "if we expose Blackwood and save Eli, what then? I can't go back to teaching grammar to children of privilege. Not after this." "The path reveals itself one step at a time," Blue Hawk replied with the serene wisdom that seemed to come so naturally to him. "First, we must ensure there is a future to consider." Yellowknife returned near midnight with a bundle of clothes and a leather folio containing various documents. "You are now Miss Rebecca Burns, Special Investigator for the Department of Justice, assigned by the Attorney General himself to review judicial conduct in the New Mexico Territory." The forged credentials were impressively authentic. Official letterhead, proper seals, even a personal note from the Attorney General to Judge Blackwood, introducing Miss Burns and requesting his full cooperation. "Your forger is very good," Lila observed, examining the papers carefully. "He should be. It cost enough," Yellowknife replied dryly. "Train tickets are included. You leave tomorrow at noon. First class, as befits a federal representative." He grinned suddenly. "Your faithful Indian scout accompanies you, of course. The Department of Justice being progressive enough to recognize native tracking skills." Blue Hawk snorted softly at this, but nodded approval of the arrangement. "We will need weapons," he noted. "I doubt they will let an Indian carry a rifle onto the train, but small knives can be hidden." "Already arranged," Yellowknife assured him, "along with something special." He unwrapped a small Derringer pistol from a cloth. "For the lady, easily concealed in a purse or sleeve." Lila took the tiny weapon, noting its pearl grips and delicate engraving. It was a lady's gun, designed to be ornamental as well as functional. Yet for all its feminine styling, it was still deadly at close range. A fitting metaphor, she thought, for the role she was about to play. They spent the remainder of the night finalizing plans, rehearsing cover stories, and preparing for all possible contingencies. By dawn, Lila had transformed herself mentally into Rebecca Burns, federal investigator, confident, authoritative, accustomed to wielding power in a man's world. The physical transformation came later, after they reached Yellowknife's home once more. Mary helped Lila don the clothes Yellowknife had procured, a severe but fashionable traveling suit in dark blue, complete with matching hat and gloves. Her hair was arranged in a no-nonsense style that nonetheless framed her face attractively. When she stood before the small mirror in Mary's room, Lila barely recognized herself. Gone was any trace of the frightened woman from the stockyard in Dodge City. In her place stood someone formidable, a woman with purpose, authority, and the determination to see justice done regardless of the cost. "You look like my sister did when she argued before the Supreme Court," said a new voice from the doorway. Lila turned to find a slender man in his early 30s standing there, his clothes dusty from travel but unmistakably those of an Eastern gentleman. His face bore a striking resemblance to her own, the same blue eyes, the same determined set of the jaw. "William," she breathed, hardly believing her eyes. "How?" "What's that name?" Senator William Burns stepped into the room, exhaustion evident in his stance but relief lighting his features. "When you disappeared, I moved heaven and earth to find you. Called in favors from the Army, the Pinkerton Agency, anyone who might have information." He glanced toward the main room where Blue Hawk and Yellowknife waited. "Your friends sent word to me through channels I established years ago for my investigation. I came as quickly as I could." Lila embraced her cousin fiercely, weeks of tension and fear momentarily overwhelming her composure. Then she stepped back, wiping away tears that threatened to spoil her carefully constructed appearance. "We have the evidence, William. Everything you need to bring down Blackwood and his entire network. Names, dates, financial records, all of it." She gestured to the leather satchel containing Margaret's documents. "But first, we need to save the man who made this possible. They're going to execute him in Santa Fe 2 days from now." William Burns studied his cousin thoughtfully, noting the changes in her that went far beyond clothing and hairstyle. The idealistic but sheltered woman who had volunteered for his investigation had been replaced by someone harder, more determined, with the look of a person who had seen the darkness in the world and chosen to fight it rather than flee. "Then we'd better hurry," he said simply. "I believe we have a train to catch." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to depart for the station, a sudden commotion erupted outside. Yellowknife hurried to the window, then cursed softly under his breath. Marshals, he reported grimly. 4 of them, led by a man I recognize as one of Blackwood's top enforcers. They've surrounded the house. A heavy knock rattled the front door. United States Marshals, open up in the name of the law. Lila exchanged glances with Blue Hawk and her cousin, seeing her own determination reflected in their eyes. They had come too far, risked too much to be stopped now. It seems, William Burns said quietly, checking the revolver he wore concealed beneath his coat, that our plan may require some adjustment. Back door, Yellowknife said tersely, already moving toward the rear of the house. There's a root cellar with an escape tunnel. Dug it during the Arapaho uprising of '68. Go, William urged Lila, pushing the leather satchel containing Margaret's documents into her hands. Blue Hawk, get her to Santa Fe. I'll delay them here. William, no, Lila protested, but her cousin's expression was resolute. I'm a United States Senator, cousin. They can't simply shoot me, even on Blackwood's orders. He drew himself up, the full weight of his authority settling on his shoulders. Besides, they don't know about the documents yet. They're after you as a witness and Blue Hawk as Eli's known associate. Another thunderous knock rattled the doorframe. Final warning, open this door or we're coming in. Go now, William insisted, his voice leaving no room for argument. Save McKenna. Expose Blackwood. That's how you help me. Mary was already lifting a trapdoor hidden beneath a woven rug, revealing rough-hewn steps descending into darkness. Yellowknife thrust a small oil lamp into Blue Hawk's hands. The tunnel comes out in the stable behind Wilson's blacksmith, 3 blocks east, he instructed rapidly. 2 horses are saddled and waiting. The train station is 10 minutes from there. Lila hesitated only a moment longer before embracing her cousin fiercely. Be careful, she whispered. Always am, William replied with a tight smile. Now go. Blue Hawk led the way down into the root cellar as Yellowknife closed the trapdoor behind them. Above, they heard the front door splinter as the marshals forced their way in. William's authoritative voice rose in righteous indignation at this treatment of a U.S. senator, followed by confused apologies from the marshals. The diversion was working, at least momentarily. The escape tunnel was low and narrow, forcing them to hunch as they hurried through the damp darkness. Earthen walls pressed close on either side, supported by timber braces at regular intervals. The air was thick with the scent of soil and old wood. Your friends are full of surprises, Lila observed, her voice hushed despite the distance now separating them from the marshals. Yellowknife has survived by planning for every possibility, Blue Hawk replied, a good lesson for anyone in dangerous times. They emerged, as promised, in a small stable behind a blacksmith shop. 2 horses waited, already saddled and provisioned with saddlebags containing food, water, and ammunition. Blue Hawk checked both animals quickly, then helped Lila mount. We ride for the South Station, he said, swinging onto his own horse. It's smaller, used mostly for freight, less likely to be watched. They rode at a measured pace through back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Blackwood's men might be watching. Denver bustled around them, oblivious to the life and death drama playing out in its midst. Storekeepers swept sidewalks, children played in dusty lots, women gossiped on porches. The ordinary tapestry of frontier life continuing uninterrupted. The South Station was indeed smaller and less grand than the main terminal, a simple wooden structure serving the Denver and Rio Grande southern route. A single locomotive stood waiting, steam already building for its departure, while workers loaded the last freight cars. 2 tickets to Pueblo, Blue Hawk told the station master, placing coins on the counter. We need to make the connection to Santa Fe. The man barely glanced at them as he pushed the tickets across the scarred wooden counter. You're in luck. Train leaves in 15 minutes. Last passenger car at the rear. They boarded without incident, finding seats in the nearly empty passenger compartment. Only a traveling salesman and an elderly couple shared the car with them. As the train lurched into motion, Lila allowed herself a momentary sense of relief. They had escaped the immediate danger, at least. What do you think happened to William? She asked quietly once the rhythm of the wheels on the track had settled into a steady clacking. If he is as important as he claims, they will not harm him directly, Blue Hawk answered, but they will delay him, perhaps arrest him on false charges until Blackwood's plans are complete. Lila nodded grimly, understanding the implications. They were truly on their own now, racing against time to save Eli McKenna from a sham trial and public execution. "We need to review our strategy," she said, lowering her voice further. "Once we reach Santa Fe, we'll have very little time." Blue Hawk nodded. "The trial will be held in the territorial courthouse. Blackwood will ensure heavy security. Marshals loyal to him, perhaps hired guns disguised as lawmen." "My credentials should get me inside," Lila said, patting the leather folio containing her forged papers. "The question is, what then? Even with these documents, I can't simply stand up in open court and accuse the Chief Justice of corruption and human trafficking." "No," Blue Hawk agreed. "Such accusations would be dismissed, and you would be arrested immediately." He considered for a moment. "We need allies in Santa Fe, people who can help us when the moment comes." "Do you know anyone there?" Lila asked hopefully. A faint smile crossed Blue Hawk's weathered face. "I know everyone there. I was born in those mountains, hunted in those valleys. Before I scouted for the army, I traded with the people of Santa Fe, Spanish, Mexican, American." His eyes gleamed with quiet confidence. "There are those who owe me favors, and others who hate Blackwood enough to help us without owing anything." The train journey south was surprisingly peaceful, the rhythmic sway of the car lulling Lila into brief periods of uneasy sleep. Between these moments of rest, she and Blue Hawk refined their plan, addressing contingencies, identifying potential allies and enemies, mapping the courthouse and surrounding streets based on Blue Hawk's detailed knowledge of the area. At Pueblo, they changed trains, boarding the southern line that would take them into New Mexico territory. As they crossed the border, the landscape changed dramatically. Red rock formations rising from the desert floor, piñon pines clinging to steep slopes, vast vistas of ochre and azure stretching to distant mountain ranges. "Beautiful," Lila murmured, gazing out the window at a land so different from her New England home. "And dangerous," Blue Hawk added softly, "like all things of true beauty." By the time they reached Santa Fe, the sun was setting on their second day of travel. They had less than 24 hours before Eli's trial was scheduled to begin. The territorial capital was a study in contrasts: Spanish colonial architecture alongside American frontier buildings, Catholic churches with soaring bell towers near simple Protestant chapels, Mexican farmers selling produce next to American merchants hawking manufactured goods. The plaza at the city's heart bustled with activity even as evening approached. Blue Hawk led Lila to a small inn on a side street, run by an elderly Mexican woman named Senora Ortiz. The woman embraced Blue Hawk like a long-lost son, rapid Spanish flowing between them as she ushered them inside. No money changed hands, but the senora provided their best room and a hot meal of chicken, beans, and fresh tortillas. "Carlita will bring you clean clothes," the woman told Lila in accented English. "For tomorrow. Important to look proper in the courthouse, no?" Lila smiled gratefully. "You know why we're here?" The old woman's eyes hardened. "Judge Blackwood, he take my grandson 2 years ago. Say he stole a horse. My Tomas, he never stole nothing." She crossed herself. "They hang him, 19 years old." "I'm sorry," Lila said softly, understanding now the woman's eagerness to help them. "Blue Hawk say you have proof of the judge's crimes," Senora Ortiz continued, "that you will stop him from killing another good man tomorrow." "We'll try," Lila promised. "But we need more than proof. We need a way to present it that can't be silenced or dismissed." The old woman nodded knowingly. "For this, you should speak with Father Ignacio at the cathedral. He hates the judge more than anyone, ever since Blackwood ordered soldiers to search the church for escaped prisoners." Her voice lowered conspiratorially. "The father, he helps people sometimes. People the judge wants to hang." Blue Hawk nodded. "I will go to him now, and to others who might help us." He turned to Lila. "Rest while you can. Tomorrow will demand all our strength." After Blue Hawk departed, Lila bathed in the wooden tub Carlita, the senora's granddaughter, brought to her room. The hot water soothed muscles still aching from the mountain journey and train travel. As she soaked, she reviewed their plan yet again, searching for weaknesses, contingencies they hadn't addressed. So much could go wrong. The forged credentials might be questioned. Blackwood might recognize her. Eli might already be dead, the trial merely a formality to justify an execution already carried out. Yet despite these fears, Lila felt strangely calm. The desperate rush of the past days had crystallized into a singular purpose that transcended personal safety or conventional morality. Justice for Eli, for Margaret, for all the nameless victims of Blackwood's trafficking network. This was all that mattered now. She slept deeply that night, without dreams, her body claiming the rest it desperately needed. When she woke to Santa Fe's brilliant morning sunlight streaming through the window, she found a black dress laid out for her, severe but elegant, appropriate for a government official attending court. Blue Hawk was waiting in the small dining room, speaking quietly with a tall man in a priest's cassock. Both men rose as Lila entered. "Miss Burns, may I present Father Ignacio?" Blue Hawk said formally. The priest was younger than Lila had expected, perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes and the weathered complexion of a man who spent time outdoors despite his clerical duties. He bowed slightly. "Blue Hawk has told me of your mission," he said, his English flawless but marked by a slight Spanish accent. "The church stands with you against this corruption." "I'm grateful, Father," Lila replied, "but I'm not sure what the church can do in a territorial courtroom." A smile touched the priest's lips. "Judge Blackwood considers himself a faithful Catholic, at least publicly. He cannot refuse me entry to observe the proceedings." He gestured to a leather case beside his chair. "I also bring you this, courtesy of friends at the territorial newspaper." He opened the case to reveal a Colt revolver, smaller than Eli's but no less deadly. "It can be concealed beneath your skirts. A last resort, we pray." Lila accepted the weapon, checking it with the practiced ease of a woman who had left civilized niceties far behind. "Thank you, Father." As they finished a simple breakfast, Blue Hawk outlined what he had learned overnight. "The trial begins at 10. Security will be heavy. Blackwood has deputized a dozen men to supplement the regular marshals. Eli is being held in a cell beneath the courthouse. He has been questioned, but is still alive." The euphemism wasn't lost on Lila. Her jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "And our supporters?" "In place," Blue Hawk confirmed. "The newspaper editor, the head of the Merchants Association, several ranchers who have suffered under Blackwood's corrupt rulings. All will be in the courtroom, waiting for our signal. And outside the courthouse," Father Ignacio added, "many of my parishioners will gather. People who have lost loved ones to Blackwood's justice. They will create a distraction if needed." Lila nodded, satisfied. "Then it's time." They left the inn separately. Father Ignacio first, then Blue Hawk, and finally Lila, now fully embodying her role as Rebecca Burns, Department of Justice investigator. She walked with measured confidence toward the courthouse, a grand sandstone building dominating the north side of the plaza. The building was indeed heavily guarded. Armed men flanked the entrance, checking those who entered. A small crowd had already gathered outside, held back by a line of deputies. Lila noted with satisfaction that many wore the simple clothes of Mexican laborers and farmers, Father Ignacio's parishioners, positioned as promised. As she approached the entrance, a deputy stepped forward to intercept her. "Courts by invitation only today, ma'am." Lila opened her leather folio, presenting her credentials with cool authority. "Rebecca Burns, Special Investigator for the Department of Justice. I believe Judge Blackwood is expecting me." The deputy frowned, clearly caught off guard. He examined her papers, then glanced uncertainly at a superior officer nearby. The officer approached, took the credentials, and studied them carefully. "Wait here, Miss Burns," he said finally. "I'll need to confirm these with the judge." He disappeared into the courthouse, leaving Lila standing under the watchful eyes of the remaining deputies. Minutes ticked by, each seeming longer than the last. Had the forgery been detected? Was her deception about to collapse before she even entered the building? The officer returned, his expression professionally blank. "Judge Blackwood will see you in his chambers before the trial, Miss Burns." Relief coursed through her, though she allowed none of it to show on her face. "Thank you, Marshal." She was escorted through the courthouse's imposing entrance hall and up a broad staircase to the second floor. The corridor was lined with heavy wooden doors, the one at the end bearing a brass plaque reading, "Arnold Roland Blackwood, Chief Justice." The marshal knocked, then opened the door at a muffled command from within. "Miss Burns, Your Honor." Judge Roland Blackwood rose from behind a massive oak desk as Lila entered. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that assessed her with clinical precision. His chambers were opulent by territorial standards, leather-bound law books, fine furniture, oil paintings of stern-faced predecessors on the walls. "Miss Burns," he said, his voice cultured, resonant with authority. "This is a surprise. I've received no notification from Washington about a Department of Justice investigation." Lila met his gaze steadily. "The Attorney General prefers discretion in matters of judicial conduct, Your Honor, particularly when they involve allegations as sensitive as those against you." A flicker of something, alarm, amusement, crossed Blackwood's features before his professional mask settled back into place. "Allegations? I wasn't aware of any complaints about my court." "No?" Lila removed a folder from her folio, placing it on his desk. "Perhaps you should examine these documents then. They make for fascinating reading." It was a calculated risk. These weren't Margaret's original papers. Those remained safely hidden at the inn, but carefully selected copies that hinted at the full extent of the evidence without revealing all their cards. Blackwood opened the folder, his expression unchanging as he scanned the first page. Only a slight tightening around his eyes betrayed any reaction. He flipped through several more pages before closing the folder with deliberate calm. "Interesting fiction, Miss Burns," he said smoothly. "Though I fail to see why the Department of Justice would take such allegations seriously. These documents are obviously forgeries, possibly created by the very criminal I'm putting on trial today." "Eli McKenna," Lila said, "a rancher accused of—" "What exactly, Your Honor? The charges seem to change depending on who's describing them." Blackwood's smile was cold. "Murder, Miss Burns. Conspiracy. Obstruction of justice. Quite a litany for a simple cattleman, wouldn't you agree?" "Indeed," Lila replied, almost as if someone were determined to silence him permanently. The pretense was wearing thin on both sides now, the verbal fencing merely a formality before the real battle began. Blackwood studied her with new intensity, his initial dismissiveness giving way to wary respect. "You're not from the Justice Department," he said finally. "So the question becomes, who are you and what is your interest in McKenna?" Lila smiled, offering no answer. Let him wonder. Let uncertainty gnaw at his confidence. Blackwood leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Whatever McKenna has promised you, I can double it, triple it. A woman of your capabilities would be an asset to my organization." "I'm not for sale, Judge Blackwood," Lila replied evenly. "Unlike so many in your orbit." His expression hardened. "Then you're a fool, and fools don't fare well in this territory." He gestured to the door. "The trial begins in 30 minutes. You're welcome to observe, Miss, whatever your name truly is. Perhaps seeing McKenna's fate will help you reconsider my offer." Lila turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One question, Your Honor. Did you order Margaret McKenna's death, or merely benefit from it?" Blackwood's face revealed nothing, but his knuckles whitened as his hands gripped the edge of his desk. "I don't know who that is." "No?" Lila's voice was soft. "That's strange, because she knew you very well indeed." She left without waiting for a response, the marshal outside the door escorting her to the courtroom. The large chamber was already filling with spectators, some there for the spectacle of justice, others positioned strategically according to Blue Hawk's arrangements. Father Ignacio sat in the front row, his expression serene. Blue Hawk stood at the back, barely noticeable despite his heritage. Years of blending into white society serving him well now. Lila took a seat near the center aisle where she could see and be seen. The leather satchel containing the original documents rested at her feet, the small revolver concealed beneath her skirts, both ready for the moment when they would be needed. At precisely 10 o'clock, a side door opened, and Eli McKenna was led in, his hands and feet shackled. Lila barely contained her shock at his appearance. His face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut, his movements stiff with pain. The questioning Blue Hawk had mentioned had clearly been brutal. Yet despite his injuries, Eli's back was straight, his expression defiant. He scanned the courtroom slowly, his gaze passing over Lila without a flicker of recognition, exactly as they had planned. They couldn't risk Blackwood noticing any connection between them. The bailiff called for all to rise as Judge Blackwood entered, resplendent in his black robes, the very picture of judicial authority. The irony was almost unbearable. The greatest criminal in the territory presiding over a sham trial meant to silence the man who could expose him. "Be seated," Blackwood intoned gravely. "The Territorial Court of New Mexico is now in session." He looked down at Eli with well-feigned regret. "Eli McKenna, you stand accused of the murder of Federal Marshal James Wilson, conspiracy against the United States government, and obstruction of justice. How do you plead?" Eli's voice was rough but unwavering. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Blackwood nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. "Let the record show the defendant has entered a plea of not guilty. We will proceed directly to the presentation of evidence." A young prosecutor rose, presenting a case so clearly fabricated that under normal circumstances it would have been laughable. Marshal Wilson, one of the men who had captured Eli in the mountains, had been killed, certainly. But the evidence placing the blame on Eli was transparently false. Witnesses clearly coached. The timeline impossible. Eli had no defense counsel. In the territories, this wasn't unusual for those without means to pay, but for a capital case, it was a blatant violation of proper procedure. When the prosecutor finished his presentation, Blackwood turned to Eli. "Mr. McKenna, do you have anything to say in your defense before this court renders its verdict?" Eli stood slowly, his chains clanking in the hushed courtroom. "Only this, Your Honor. The real criminal in this courtroom isn't standing in chains. He's wearing robes." A murmur swept through the spectators. Blackwood's face darkened with anger. "You will show respect for this court, Mr. McKenna." "I respect the law," Eli replied steadily, "which is why I cannot respect you, Roland Blackwood. Not when I know about the women and children you've sold. Not when I know about the bribes you've taken, the men you've had killed, the lives you've destroyed for profit." Blackwood's gavel crashed down. "Silence. One more outburst, and I'll have you gagged for the remainder of these proceedings." It was the moment they had planned for. Lila rose to her feet, the leather satchel in her hands. "Your Honor, I request permission to present evidence relevant to these proceedings." Blackwood glared at her, trapped by his own judicial procedures and the watching crowd. "This is most irregular, Miss Burns. What evidence could you possibly have that bears on this case?" "Evidence of the true criminal conspiracy in this territory," Lila said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent courtroom. "Financial records, witness statements, and official documents proving that you, Judge Roland Blackwood, have been operating a human trafficking network across the Western Territories for at least 7 years." The courtroom erupted. Blackwood's gavel pounded furiously, but the noise only grew as people began to shout questions, accusations, and calls for order. In the confusion, Blue Hawk moved swiftly toward the bailiff, who held the keys to Eli's shackles. "This is outrageous," Blackwood bellowed above the din. "Marshals, remove this woman immediately." 2 men moved toward Lila, but found their path suddenly blocked by Father Ignacio and several burly ranchers. Outside, the sounds of an even larger commotion could be heard. Father Ignacio's parishioners creating their promised distraction. "The evidence was gathered by Margaret McKenna, a court clerk in Denver," Lila continued, her voice rising above the chaos. "Before you had her poisoned, Your Honor. Evidence her husband, Eli McKenna, has protected for 5 years, waiting for the right moment to expose you." Blackwood's face contorted with rage and dawning fear as he saw the control of his courtroom and his carefully constructed empire slipping away. "This is a fabrication, a desperate ploy by a condemned man." "Is it?" Lila countered, opening the satchel and beginning to distribute copies of Margaret's documents to the newspapermen and community leaders positioned throughout the courtroom. "Are the banking records fabrications? The witness statements? The list of missing women and children whose disappearances coincide precisely with your circuit court schedule?" The marshals loyal to Blackwood tried to intervene, but found themselves outnumbered by the citizens who had suffered under his corrupt rule. Blue Hawk had reached Eli now, using a key slipped to him by the bailiff, another victim of Blackwood's injustice, whose brother had been wrongfully executed the previous year. Blackwood saw his advantage disappearing and made a desperate move. He pulled a derringer from beneath his robes and aimed it directly at Lila. "Enough!" he shouted. "Drop those papers or I'll shoot you where you stand." The courtroom froze in sudden silence. Lila stood motionless, the documents still in her hands, her eyes locked with Blackwood's. In them, she saw not the distinguished jurist, but the cornered predator, dangerous, desperate, capable of anything. "You can't shoot everyone in this courtroom, Judge," she said quietly, "and they've all seen what's in these papers now. Your network is exposed. Your protectors in Washington will abandon you rather than be tainted by association." "You understand nothing," Blackwood snarled, his cultured facade crumbling entirely. "The wealth, the power you're threatening, it isn't just mine. There are men who would burn this entire territory to the ground rather than lose what I've built for them." "Perhaps," Lila acknowledged, "but you'll still hang." With a roar of fury, Blackwood pulled the trigger. The Derringer's report was deafening in the confined space of the courtroom. Lila felt a searing pain across her upper arm as the bullet grazed her. Before Blackwood could fire again, another shot rang out. The judge staggered backward, a look of profound surprise crossing his face as a crimson stain blossomed on his black robes. He looked down at it in apparent confusion, then collapsed behind the bench. Eli McKenna stood at the defendant's table, his shackles gone, holding the pistol Blue Hawk had slipped him. His face was grim but resolved, the face of a man who had finally fulfilled a promise made long ago for Margaret, he said simply. The aftermath unfolded with surprising speed. The marshals loyal to Blackwood, seeing their patron dead and the evidence of his crime spreading through the courtroom, surrendered without further resistance. The citizens Father Ignacio had gathered outside the courthouse prevented any of Blackwood's men from escaping the city. William Burns arrived the following day with federal agents. Having been released from custody in Denver, once news of Blackwood's death reached the authorities there. The investigation he launched would eventually lead to the arrests of 3 congressmen, a territorial governor, and dozens of local officials implicated in Margaret McKenna's documents. William Burns used his position as a United States Senator to ensure the case received national attention. His impassioned speeches on the Senate floor about the trafficking network shocked the nation and led to the formation of a special congressional committee, territorial law enforcement. Despite threats to his political career from colleagues implicated in Blackwood's documents, William remained steadfast in his pursuit of justice. He made monthly visits to New Mexico Territory, dividing his time between his senatorial duties in Washington and his ongoing work with Eli and Lila to dismantle what remained of the criminal network. His personal experience with the corruption had transformed him from a cautious politician to a crusader for territorial reform, earning him both powerful enemies and devoted allies in the halls of power. The human trafficking network, deprived of its head and protection, collapsed under the weight of public outrage and federal prosecution. Hundreds of women and children were freed from effective slavery, many reunited with families who had thought them lost forever. Eli McKenna was exonerated of all charges, the territorial court acknowledging that he had acted to prevent the escape of a dangerous criminal. He bore his new status as hero with the same quiet stoicism with which he had endured being labeled an outlaw. 1 week after Blackwood's death, Eli and Lila stood on the platform of the Santa Fe station, watching as Blue Hawk said his farewells to Father Ignacio and the others who had helped them. "What will you do now?" Lila asked, her arms still bandaged where Blackwood's bullet had grazed her. Eli gazed out at the mountains rising beyond the city, their peaks catching the morning sunlight. "Go home, I suppose. The cattle need tending." "Alone?" The question was quiet, laden with meanings neither of them had yet put into words. Eli turned to her, really looking at her for perhaps the first time since their desperate plan had succeeded. "That depends," he said finally. "On what?" "On whether a Boston schoolteacher could find anything worthwhile in a life on a remote cattle ranch with an aging former bounty hunter." Lila smiled, remembering the woman she had been just weeks ago. Proper, cautious, bound by society's expectations. That woman seemed impossibly distant now, like a character in a novel she had once read. "I'm not sure that Boston's schoolteacher exists anymore," she said thoughtfully. "But the woman who took her place might find a great deal worthwhile in such a life, particularly if it included continuing William's work against the trafficking networks that remain." Something like hope flickered in Eli's weathered face. "It would be dangerous work." "I'm becoming quite accustomed to danger," Lila replied with a slight smile. From his pocket, Eli withdrew the small leather pouch he had carried for so long. Opening it carefully, he tipped Margaret's wedding ring into his palm. He studied it for a long moment, then held it out to Lila. "She would have wanted you to have this," he said simply, "not as anything more than a token of thanks for finishing what she started, for making her death mean something, after all." Lila accepted the ring, closing her fingers gently around it. "I'll treasure it," she promised, "in the memory of the remarkable woman who wore it." Blue Hawk approached, interrupting the moment with his characteristic good timing. "The train north leaves in 10 minutes, he announced. "If we're to make our connection to Cimarron." "We?" Eli asked, raising an eyebrow. Blue Hawk's face remained impassive, but his eyes held a glint of amusement. "Someone must keep you both alive, old friend. The remaining traffickers will not forget what happened here." He glanced between them, noting the ring in Lila's hand. "Besides, 3 guns are better than 2. As they boarded the train that would take them north toward Eli's ranch and whatever future awaited them there, Lila found herself thinking of that moment in the Dodge City stockyard that now seemed a lifetime ago. A single dollar placed on a barrel, a human life valued and saved. What was the price of a soul? Not a dollar, certainly, not even the blood and sacrifice that had followed. Perhaps, she reflected as the train pulled away from the station, the true price was the willingness to stand against evil, regardless of the cost. The courage to look injustice in the face and say, "Not today, not ever again." It was a price she had paid willingly, and would again, if necessary. The train gathered speed, carrying them north toward the mountains and whatever battles still lay ahead. But for now, they had won. Justice had been served. And 3 unlikely allies, a former bounty hunter, a Boston schoolteacher, and an Apache scout, had changed the course of history in the New Mexico territory, all for the price of a soul. Months later, as winter settled over Cimarron Valley, Eli stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching as Lila taught a group of rescued children to read beneath the old cottonwood tree. Blue Hawk sat nearby, carving a whistle from cedar wood while keeping a vigilant eye on the horizon. The letter that had arrived that morning from William Burns warned of new troubles brewing. A consortium of wealthy Easterners connected to Blackwood's operation had put a price on all 3 of their heads, substantial enough that professional manhunters would soon come looking. Eli's hand instinctively moved to his side, where Margaret's wedding band now hung on the same cord that circled Lila's neck. Not a proposal, but a promise of something neither had dared name. The cattle grazed peacefully in the valley below, fat and content in the golden afternoon light. It was a moment of tranquility they had fought and bled for, a peace purchased at tremendous cost. "They'll come for us eventually," Blue Hawk said without looking up from his carving. "Let them come," Eli replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had faced his demons and survived. "Some things are worth fighting for." Lila glanced up from her lesson, catching his eye across the yard. Her smile, something that came more easily these days, held no trace of the frightened woman from the Dodge City stockyard. In its place was something fiercer, something that matched the resolve in Eli's own heart. Some souls, Eli reflected, watching as Lila returned to her teaching, weren't measured in dollars at all, but in courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand against darkness when others looked away. And in that accounting, they were all 3 of them wealthy beyond measure.